The first sign was the smell. Kura Vasilis had spent 11 years on a Veth processing station, which meant she had spent 11 years breathing recycled air that tasted of machine oil and other people's exhalations. She knew every flavor the station's scrubbers could produce. The metallic bite after a whole stress event, the faint sweetness when the algae tanks overfired, the particular dead rubber stink of a Veth technician who had been standing too close to a resonance emitter. She knew all of it. She cataloged funk smells the way other people cataloged faces. So when the new smell hit her, cold and green and somehow old, like the inside of a sealed cave that had never seen human light, she stopped walking. The corridor was empty. Third sublevel, Service Passage 7 Delta, the kind of hall that existed only to let maintenance crews move equipment from one functional area to another. The walls were unpainted alloy. The light strips hummed at 60 cycles. Nothing had changed, but the smell was wrong. Kara was not the sort of person who ignored wrongness. That was how you stayed alive on a Veth station. The Veth were generous employers, in the way that certain predators were generous. They fed you, sheltered you, kept you functional, and in return, they required that you not ask too many questions about what happened behind the sealed doors on sublevel 6. Kara had learned this in her first week. She had spent the next 10 years and 11 months in a state of careful, disciplined not looking. The smell did not care about her discipline. She followed it. The door at the end of Passage 7 Delta was not supposed to be open. It was a cold storage access, rated for biological materials, the kind of door that required both a Veth override key and a human supervisor code to open. The Veth had the first. Kara had the second in her chest implant, and she had never once been asked to use it. The door was ajar by perhaps 4 centimeters. Kara was not small. 11 years of physical labor on a station with intermittent gravity regulation had given her a body that was more architecture than biology. Dense, load-bearing, built for sustained effort rather than speed. She was 41 years old, had a scar that ran from her left elbow to her wrist from a coolant line rupture in year 3. And she wore her black hair in a braid that she kept wound twice around her head to keep it out of machinery. None of these things were relevant to what was behind the door. All of these things were relevant to what happened next. Shfush pushed the door open with her shoulder. The room was cold enough that her breath came out in plumes. The lighting was Veth blue, that particular spectrum they preferred. Somewhere between ultraviolet and what human eyes registered as deep violet. The color of a bruise made of light. Cold storage racks went back 15 meters, floor to ceiling, and every bay was full, not of biological materials, people. Kara counted 43 before she stopped counting. They were in suspensions, cradles. Veth medical equipment, she recognized the design from the station's emergency sick bay. But these were not the standard gray cradles used for injured workers. These were darker. The seals were different. And the people inside them were not asleep in any normal sense of the word. She knew 2 of them. Petra Marchetti, who had worked the atmospheric processing team on Level 2 and had been reported as a desertion case 8 months ago, and Old Hendricks, who had been with the station since before Kara arrived, who had taught her the trick of bleeding pressure from a stuck valve by tapping the release housing in a specific rhythm, who had reportedly gone off shift one evening and simply not returned. Both of them were breathing, barely. Their eyes were open, fixed on some point above the cradle that was not the ceiling, not anything in this room. Their skin had taken on a faint iridescence, the kind of shimmer Kara associated with Veth biochemical exposure, the baseline contamination that came from working too close to their fluid systems. It was much worse in Hendricks. He had been here longer. Kara stood in the cold room for a long time. She was aware, distantly, that she should close the door and walk away. That this was the specific category of thing that 11 years of discipline had trained her to not see. That whatever was in those cradles was not her problem. Hendricks had taught her the valve trick on her second day. She had been terrified and alone, and doing her best not to show either. He had shown her without being asked, without making her feel small for not knowing. He had handed her a hot mug of something that was only technically coffee and said, in his old gravel voice, "You'll be fine here, kid. You just have to learn to read the machinery." She pulled out her personal comm. Not the station-issued one. The old unit she'd kept for years. That transmitted on a frequency the Veth's monitoring systems had never bothered to cover because it was too low bandwidth to seem worth watching. And she started recording. She recorded everything. The things about living among the Veth was that you eventually stopped seeing them clearly. This was not metaphor. The Veth emitted a low-frequency resonance. Not quite sound, not quite electromagnetic. Something in the crack between those categories that human sensory systems processed as a kind of ambient blur. Neurologists on the colony ships had written about it before the integration, theorizing that long-term exposure created a kind of perceptual soft focus around Veth presence. You stopped noticing the exact details of their bodies. You stopped flinching at the way they moved, which was wrong in ways that took real effort to articulate. Too many joints, all of them capable of bending in any direction, a bilateral symmetry that didn't quite hold at close range. You stopped being disturbed by the way they communicated, which was partially sound and partially something else, a carrier wave that the human auditory system processed as speech while some deeper part of the brain registered as threat. You adapted. The human brain was extraordinarily good at adaptation. Kara had adapted better than most. So she had believed. She sat in her quarters that night. A 6x4 room that was generous by station standards. A privilege of her seniority. And she watched the recording she'd made on a loop, and she thought about what she was actually seeing now that she was forcing herself to look. The cradles were not medical equipment in any sense she recognized anymore. The connection points, she had assumed they were for vital monitoring, standard suspension feeds, were penetrating, not surface contact. They went in. The biochemical shimmer on Hendrix's skin was not contamination. It was integration. She recognized the pattern from a technical manual she'd read in her first year. One of the Veth standard integration documents that were provided to human staff as part of orientation, and that everyone once and then quietly put away. The document described the process of harmonizing human biological systems with Veth processing networks. It was described as voluntary. It was described as beneficial. The document had color graphics. 43 people were being involuntarily integrated into the Veth processing network. Kara had been on this station for 11 years, and she had known, in the way you could know something without quite letting yourself know it, that something happened to the workers who disappeared. The official explanation was desertion. The station's contract terms were grueling, and people did sometimes cut and run, accepting the financial penalties to get back to colony space. She had believed this because she had wanted to believe it. She had 2 years left on her contract. She had plans for those 2 years, and the money at the end of them. She had believed it because the alternative was this room. She made 3 copies of the recording on 3 different media formats. She put one in the heel of her work boot. She put one inside the lining of her standard issue jacket. One inside a sealed protein bar wrapper she'd been saving for use as general storage, because the Veth's material scanners interpreted sealed food packaging as background noise and never looked inside. Then she lay down on her bunk and looked at the ceiling for approximately 4 minutes before she stopped pretending she was going to sleep. Problem was not getting off the station. She had maintenance access to the docking bay. That was part of her job, keeping the external connection points functional, which meant she had both the physical access codes and the legitimate reason to be there. Problem was that a solo escape in a maintenance shuttle would be tracked and intercepted within minutes. The Veth didn't care much about individual workers running contracts. They cared a great deal about people who had been inside sub-level cold storage. The problem was that 43 people were in those cradles. The other problem was that she wasn't sure how many of them were still recoverable. The other problem, the one underneath all the other problems, was that Hendrix had told her she'd be fine. And she had been. And she couldn't locate the part of herself that was willing to leave him in there. She spent 3 days doing her job. This was not patience. It was strategy. The Veth paid very little attention to workers who continued to do their jobs. They paid enormous attention to deviations from established patterns. Kara's established pattern included specific maintenance routes, specific timing, specific equipment requisitions. She maintained all of it with the same care she maintained the station's coolant systems, methodically, attentively, without visible variation. She was also, during those 3 days, stealing, not materially. She was stealing information. She had 11 years of access to the station's maintenance systems, which gave her a detailed picture of every system's physical layout, power draw, and operational dependencies. She built this picture in her head. No documentation, nothing that could be found, and she mapped it against what she now knew about Sublevel 6. The cold storage room was on a power circuit shared with the atmospheric processing units. The suspension cradles ran on Veth biopower, which was self-contained, but the monitoring and integration systems required station power. The integration process for each occupant was on a timer. If you inputted station power to that circuit during a specific window in the integration cycle. She had Hendrix's technical notes from his first 3 years on the station, which he'd given her when she was learning maintenance basics, and which she'd kept because they were extraordinarily good notes. She reread them now. Hendrix had spent 40 years working on life support systems across 6 different stations and 2 colony ships. His notes were not simple. On the 4th day, she went back to Sublevel 6. She brought tools. She brought the portable power interrupter she'd assembled over the previous 3 days from parts that individually had legitimate maintenance uses. She brought the medical auto-injector she'd taken from the station sickbay's emergency stock, which contained a broad-spectrum neurological restorative that was rated for Veth biochemical exposure. She brought the protein bar wrapper, with the recording inside. She brought the thing she'd been building in her quarters for 2 years, which she had never expected to actually use. A tight band signal transmitter built from parts she'd been accumulating slowly enough that no single requisition looked unusual, capable of broadcasting a compressed data burst on a frequency that would reach the nearest colonial monitoring buoy. The burst would contain the recording. The burst would contain the station's coordinates. The burst would contain the integration documentation she'd copied from the orientation file. She pushed open the door to cold storage. The Veth technician inside it was standing with its back to her. The Veth were tall. This one was approximately 2 meters 20, built in the way that all Veth were built. That hard-to-focus lateral symmetry, the joints, the sense of contained mass that didn't quite match the visual profile. It was examining one of the cradles, the one with Hendrix. Kara stood very still. The Veth turned. She had spent 11 years not looking directly at them. She looked now. She made herself. She cataloged what she saw with the same systematic attention she gave to machinery. The face, if face was the right word, was partially what her brain insisted on interpreting as a face, and partially something else. The eyes, which were not eyes, were compound structures that took in light across a range she couldn't see the edges of. The resonance the creature emitted wasn't sound. It was the carrier wave that her brain processed as sound. It was saying something. She understood, for the first time in 11 years, that the resonance wasn't just communication. It was control. The soft focus she'd always felt around Veth wasn't just neural adaptation. It was being done to her. The blur was not her brain accommodating a new input. The blur was the Veth making itself not seen. She could see it now. She was seeing it now. Maintenance, she said. Her voice was level. This was a skill she'd developed young and refined over 11 years, of not showing fear in environments where showing fear was dangerous. Power fluctuation in the circuit array. I've got a work order. The Veth looked at her. Its resonance changed pitch, a question or a command. She'd never been certain which. I need to check the junction box behind rack 7, Kara said. She was already moving, not toward the door, deeper into the room, past the Veth, keeping the toolkit in her left hand and her right hand free. Shouldn't take long. The Veth watched her. The resonance continued. She had never been certain how much the Veth could read from human physiological signals. Heart rate, skin conductivity, micro-expression. The orientation documents said they were excellent empaths, meaning they were excellent at sensing human emotional states. She had spent 11 years being largely unafraid. Because she had never given herself reason to be afraid. She was using that history now. She was drawing on 11 years of documented not afraid and spending it all in this moment. She reached the junction box behind rack 7. She opened it. She began working. The Veth did not leave. It watched. Kara worked for 6 minutes, doing legitimate work. There was, in fact, a minor power fluctuation in this circuit, because she had caused it 2 days ago as a pretext, and she now fixed it, because doing the job correctly was the best possible cover. While she worked, she positioned the portable power interrupter against the integration relay behind the junction box housing. The relay was behind a panel she had checked the schematics for and knew was not visible from the Veth technician's current position. She attached the interrupter's contacts. She checked the timer. The Veth said something. Resonance. Deeper now. Almost done, Kara said. The thing about desperation is that it is not the opposite of competence. Kara had learned this early, in the way that people who have had to be competent under pressure learn it. Not as an insight, but as a physical fact, muscle memory, something encoded below the level of thought. Desperation was energy. Desperation was information. Desperation told you what mattered and what didn't. And if you could keep your hands steady and your attention sharp while the desperation was running through you, you could do things that weren't possible in calmer moments. Power interrupter fired at 0300 station time. The integration relay went dark. The suspension cradles shifted to their internal biopower backup systems, which kept the occupants alive but interrupted the integration process. And, crucially, interrupted the Veth monitoring network's connection to the room. There was a window of approximately 9 minutes before the backup monitoring systems on sub-level 6 would register the interruption and route an alert. Kara had been waiting in the corridor outside since 0245. She went in fast. The auto-injector worked at 4 stations simultaneously. She'd modified it to multi-dose, another 2 days of quiet work modification, and she moved through the room with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been planning this exact sequence for 72 hours. The neurological restorative hit bloodstreams, prompted cellular flush responses, began the slow process of reversing Veth biochemical integration. It wouldn't be fast. It wouldn't be complete. Not for the people who had been here longest. But it would stop the process and begin to restore autonomous neurological function. Hendricks was in Cradle 7. She gave him the injector last because she had given him the largest dose in her planning, and because she needed to be steady for all the others first. His skin was deeply iridescent by now, that Veth shimmer running all the way up his neck and across his jaw. His eyes, when they found her face, were not quite focused. Hendricks, she said, low. The room was silent except for the hum of the cradle systems. I need you to hear me. His eyes moved. A slow tracking, like something learning how eyes worked again. I'm Kara. You know me. Taught me the valve trick on my second day. She was already disconnecting the cradle feeds, methodical, the sequence she'd memorized from the Veth medical documentation, the disconnection order that would cause the least systemic shock. Handed me terrible coffee and told me fine. His mouth moved. No sound came out. You were right for the record, she said. I'm fine. I'm getting you out. 9 people could walk on their own. 14 could walk with support. 20 could not be moved in the time available. Kara made the decision in approximately 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds of the worst calculation of her life. And then she stopped calculating and started moving. The 9 who could walk were given positions. Guard the corridor, support the walkers, carry anyone who could be carried. She assigned these roles with the flat authority of someone who has managed maintenance crews under pressure and knows that a clear instruction followed poorly is better than a perfect plan that nobody acts on. The people in those cradles had been through something that she didn't have a word for, something between assault and surgery and theft, and they were not in a state for nuance. They needed simple, and they needed now. She went back to the 20 who couldn't be moved. She set the transmitter. Compressed burst would take 11 seconds to fire. The recording, the coordinates, the integration documentation, the names. She had recorded the names of all 43 occupants from the Cradle ID tags during her initial 3 days of planning. All 43 names, attached to the documentation, attached to the station's operational records, attached to everything she had been able to copy in 72 hours of careful theft. She also set the second thing. The junction box behind Rack 7, connected to the primary atmospheric circulation system for sublevels 5 and 6. Death physiology required a specific atmospheric composition that was slightly different from human standard. Higher in a particular trace gas that the station's systems maintained at different concentration on different levels. Cold storage room was maintained at Veth standard. The rest of sublevel 6 was maintained at Veth standard, because sublevel 6 was primarily Veth space. If the atmospheric circulation on sublevel 6 shifted to human standard, it would not immediately harm the Veth. It would, however, significantly impair the resonance effect, the carrier wave that created the perceptual soft focus, the control signal, the not-seen blur. Veth resonance required a specific atmospheric medium to propagate effectively. Human standard air broke it up. It was the difference between being seen clearly and being seen through a haze. Kara set the atmospheric controls. Then she went to find the remaining workers who could be moved and began the process of moving them. The station had 14 emergency life pods rated for human occupancy. Kara had access to 12 of them through her maintenance clearances. She did not attempt to be quiet about using them, because there was no longer any point in being quiet. The interrupter had bought 9 minutes. The atmospheric shift had bought confusion. What she needed now was speed. She was guiding the last group of walking workers toward Pod Bay 3 when the Veth came. There were 4 of them. They moved the way the Veth moved. That fluid wrongness, joints operating in configurations that her eyes kept trying to reinterpret as something less disturbing. And they came from the corridor ahead, not behind, which meant they had anticipated her route. They had anticipated her route because they knew the station's layout, and because she was predictable. She had maintenance clearances to 12 life pods, and she had been using them systematically, which meant any analyst watching her pattern could see exactly where she was going next. 11 years on a maintenance station. 11 years of pattern building, of systematic methodology, of doing the job the same way every time because consistency was survival. She had the same problem and the opposite problem simultaneously. Pod Bay 4, she said to the workers behind her. Her voice was flat and clear and left no room for negotiation. Through the service tunnel to the left. Now, do not wait for me. Nobody waited. That was the thing about people who had been in those cradles. Whatever the integration process had done to them, it had not dulled the survival instinct. They moved. The Veth in the corridor ahead spread slightly. A herding geometry, she recognized. Something she'd seen them do with equipment when they needed to move it without damaging it. They were not trying to harm her. They were trying to contain her. They needed her to not have distributed that signal burst. They needed her to be recoverable. The 20 people she'd had to leave behind were recoverable. The resonance hit her, full strength, without the atmospheric damping, because this corridor was at human standard, but she was only 40 meters from sublevel 6, and the effect bled through the floor. The blur came back. She felt it happen. That was new. She had never felt it happen before because it had always already been happening. Ambient, background, the water she swam in. She could feel it arriving. A soft pressure behind her eyes. A gentle dimming of her own thoughts. A suggestion that things were not quite what she had thought they were. That there was a more reasonable interpretation of the situation. That she had perhaps been hasty. Kara had spent 11 years learning to read machinery, She read this now. The signal, the mechanism, the direction it was pushing her. She did not fight it the way you'd fight a physical thing, because it was not a physical thing. She let it come and she watched it come, and she named what it was doing with the specific clinical attention of a technician identifying a fault. Atmospheric bleed from sublevel 6. Resonance impairment partial. Duration, approximately 4 minutes before the circulation equalization would reach this corridor fully. 4 minutes. She had the power interrupter. She had the modified auto-injector, now empty. She had her toolkit, which contained a high-pressure sealant applicator that could fire its canister at approximately 40 meters per second, which was not a weapon by any reasonable definition, but was definitely something. She was pointing at the lead Veth's face. You have 43 workers in illegal integration cradles on sublevel 6, she said. The blur was thickening. She kept talking. Talking helped. I have transmitted documentation of this to Colonial Monitoring Buoy, Relay 7. That transmission will reach the Colonial Oversight Commission in approximately 18 hours. The Veth in the corridor held position. I want the 20 I couldn't move. I want them in the corridor with me, walking, in the next 3 minutes. And I want the station manager to authorize emergency transport to Dock 6 Alpha, where I am putting everyone in life pods. The resonance changed. She didn't have words for what it was saying. She only had the emotional translation her brain attempted. Something between threat and disbelief, and a strange quality she had never felt from the Veth before. She thought about it for a fraction of a second, and then identified it. They didn't think she could see them. They were not accustomed to humans who could see them. The resonance was so fundamental to their interactions with humans that they had no framework for a human who was actively mechanising it, who was naming the mechanism, who was standing in a corridor with a sealant applicator, and the flat, determined look of someone who had done the calculation and found the odds acceptable. The blur was thinning. The corridor air was equalizing. 3 minutes, Kara said. The station manager was a Veth named something that human vocal apparatus could not reproduce, which meant it was designated in human records as Station Administrator Verek. She had met it twice in 11 years, both times in the context of formal contract review. It was the oldest Veth on the station by a significant margin, and the oldest was relevant because Veth age correlated with resonance strength in ways that had been documented in the xenobiology literature that Kara had read during the 3 days of planning and had found deeply unpleasant. Verek met her at the entrance to Pod Bay 4. The 20 from the cradles were behind it, walking barely, leaning on each other and on the Veth technicians who were supporting them. And there was something about that image, the compromised and the compromising, the ones who had been taken apart and the ones who had taken them apart, that Kara chose to file away for later, because processing it now would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. Verek's resonance was a wall. Even through the equalized air, it hit her like pressure. Like the feeling before a door seals. The air density change that your body recognizes as a warning even before your conscious mind catches up. She stood in it. She named it again, internally, pressure, resonance, Veth control signal, not real, and she watched Verek the way she watched complicated machinery. Verek spoke. The station's translation system rendered it as, "You have caused significant operational disruption. I have caused the minimum disruption consistent with getting 43 people out of illegal integration cradles," Kara said. The integration protocol is not. A pause. The translation system hunting for a word. Illegal. The workers' contracts contain provisions for operational integration requirements. The contracts contain provisions for voluntary procedural integration of working systems, Kara said, not involuntary neurological integration into the processing network. I read the contracts. I read them when I first arrived, and I reread them this week. I also read the Colonial Labor Compact, Articles 14 through 22. What you have on Sublevel 6 violates 7 specific provisions and constitutes forced modification of human neurological architecture, which is a compact violation, regardless of contract language. Verek's resonance shifted. She had never paid attention to the specific quality of Veth resonance shifts before. She was paying attention now. "You are one worker," Varric said, "with an 11-year maintenance record, 2 years remaining on your contract. I am one worker with a recording, documentation, 43 witness names, and a signal burst that is currently traveling toward Colonial Monitoring Buoy Relay 7 at the speed of light," Kara said. "You can add assault and interference with emergency communications to the compact violations if you'd like. You can let these people into Pod Bay 4. Varric regarded her. The resonance was not thinning. If anything, it was intensifying, and she was not immune to it. Head was beginning to ache in the specific way that she would later learn to describe as resonance headache, a phenomenon that colonial physicians would spend considerable time documenting in the months following this incident. The edges of her vision were slightly soft. Thoughts were arriving with a slight lag, as if processing through an additional translation step. She breathed. She counted machinery. She thought about the valve trick, and about terrible coffee, and about Hendrix's gravel voice. "You'll be fine here, kid. You just have to learn to read the machinery." "I'm not leaving without them," she said. Her voice was steady. "I haven't spent 11 years maintaining your station, so I could leave without the people I came for. Going to let us through that door. Because the alternative is a colonial oversight investigation with 43 named witnesses, documented integration violations, and a station manager who made the active decision to block a rescue operation." She paused. "Or you let us through the door now, and the documentation still gets there, but the active obstruction piece doesn't." The resonance held for a long moment. The translation system rendered nothing. Then Varric stepped aside. There were 16 life pods total, 12 that Kara had already loaded. 10 people in the last group, plus Kara herself, which meant 2 pods, which meant she was the last person in the last pod, and she stood at the bay threshold for a moment that she could not entirely account for later. Looking back at the station corridor, at the Veth technicians watching with their compound eyes, at the particular violet blue of the station lighting. 11 years she got in the pod. 41 hours later, the Colonial Oversight Commission's Fast Response Vessel, CCVS, Irreversible, arrived at the station's coordinates, directed by the signal burst and by the life pod's own emergency beacons. The Commission's investigative team found the station operational, the Veth staff fully present, and Sub-Level 6's cold storage room recently and thoroughly cleaned. They also found 11 years of maintenance records filed under Kara Vasilis's employee number, cross-referenced with every piece of equipment in the building, because Kara had understood before she ever filed her first maintenance report that a properly documented station was a station that could be audited. She had kept records the way she kept coolant systems, meticulously, completely, with the slightly excessive attention to detail that comes from knowing that a missed entry is the thing that will come back to kill you. The records contained, among other things, 11 years of power consumption data from Sub-Level 6. 41 names matched the consumption spikes to dates when workers had been reported as desertions. The investigation ran for 4 months. Varric and 2 senior technicians were removed from the station. The integration protocols were classified as compact violations under the new Vasilis standard, named without her knowledge or permission, and which she found out about 6 months later. When a commission administrator mentioned it in a briefing, she was attending in an entirely different context. "You named a legal standard after me," she said. The administrator looked mildly embarrassed. "It was the investigation team's decision." "I would have preferred they name it after Hendrix," Kara said. "He's the one who taught me to keep the records." Hendrix spent 63 days in a colonial medical facility, having the integration reversed. Process was not gentle, and the reversal was not complete. He would have the iridescent shimmer on his skin for the rest of his life. Faint by the time he was discharged, visible only in certain lighting. But there, a watermark of something that had been done to him, without his knowledge or consent. He came to find her when he was discharged. She was in the middle of her own debrief, which had been running for the better part of 2 months, at a commission facility on Meridian Station. He walked into the briefing room, unannounced, which no one who knew him found surprising. "You came back," he said. "You told me I'd be fine," she said. "It seemed like the least I could do." He sat down heavily in one of the briefing chairs. He looked old in a way he hadn't before, which she didn't say, and he looked relieved in a way that was almost too much to look at directly, which she also didn't say. "How many?" he asked. 43 in the room. 41 names on the audit trail. 2 we couldn't recover fully." She kept her voice even. 39 complete reversals. Hendricks was quiet for a moment. The 2. They were in longest. Their neurological architecture was. The integration was too far along. She stopped. "They're alive. Their cognition is." She stopped again. "They're alive." Hendricks nodded. His jaw was tight. "And you?" "I'm fine." She said it the same way he had said it to her, 11 years ago, in the specific tone of someone who means it and knows it and is also fully aware that fine is not the same as unchanged. "I just had to learn to read the machinery." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his expression that was not quite surprise and not quite pride, but was in the territory between them. "I taught you better than I knew," he said. "You really did," she said. The 43rd person in the cradles. The last one. The one she'd had least information on. Someone who had arrived at the station only weeks before the cold storage room. Turned out to be a commission field agent who had been investigating the station for unrelated reasons and had gotten too close. His name was Damien Cho. He spent 40 days in medical recovery and then spent 6 months trying to write his incident report. The incident report kept coming out wrong. Every time he tried to write the section about how the investigation had resolved, he found himself returning to the same moment. Waking up in the cold and the Veth blue light. With his vision unfocused and his thoughts running slowly, and then a woman's voice, saying his name like it mattered that he still had one, and the distinct sensation of the world coming back into focus from a very long way away. He eventually wrote it this way. Subject was recovered by station maintenance worker Kara Vasilis. Commendation. See supplementary report. The supplementary report was classified almost immediately, which he had expected. What he had not expected was the footnote added by the Commission Review Board, which noted that the 42 recovery cases and associated legal precedents had been initiated by a single worker with no investigative training, no support infrastructure, and no particular certainty of success, operating on the basis of a valve trick and 11 years of coffee that was only technically coffee. Footnote did not use those specific words, but that was what it said. The Veth, as a species, did not change their practices immediately after the investigation. This surprised no one who had studied their institutional culture, which operated on timescales that made human bureaucracy look impulsive. They adapted gradually, adjusting their contracts, establishing new protocols, creating the oversight structures that the colonial compact now required. What they did not entirely understand, and what took another 2 decades of xenological study to document, was the mechanism by which a human worker had been able to resist the resonance effect long enough to act. The answer, when it came, was not what anyone expected. It was not exceptional neurology. It was not some rare genetic variation that made Kara Vasilis unusual. It was not resistance in any biological sense. It was 11 years of learning to name things. The resonance worked by creating a perceptual gap between what a human sensed and what a human processed consciously. You saw the Veth, but you didn't quite notice what you'd seen. You felt the signal, but you attributed it to ambient unease. The system worked because humans were extraordinarily good at not noticing things that were uncomfortable to notice. Kara had spent 11 years noticing. Not the Veth specifically. She had avoided looking at them as carefully as everyone else. But everything else. Every smell, every power consumption spike, every deviation from expected equipment behavior. She had built a practice of precise attention that was so thoroughgoing that when she finally directed it at the resonance effect, it couldn't hide. She'd had too much practice finding hidden things. The xenologists wrote this up in language that was appropriately technical and dry. The commission cited the studies in 12 subsequent policy documents. Kara read the paper once, on a slow shift at a new posting on a different station, and put it down and went back to work. She had a valve that needed looking at. She tapped the release housing in the specific rhythm Hendrix had taught her. It opened.